I'm finally beginning to embark on the very last leg of our depression lecture notes. And we are going to jump right into the lecture here at serotonin, motor activity, and depression-related disorders. There's a really interesting connection between serotonin and motor actions that was not known until fairly recently. And it has been found that there are serotonergic neurons that play crucial roles in tonic motor actions and in the sensory information processing. And serotonin neurons are usually silent during REM sleep. Now, that should make you think back a little bit to when we were talking about differences in sleep stages in those people who have clinical depression, and that some of them enter REM sleep sooner than they should. So connect that with this for a moment, and you're going to see where this is leading us. Depressive symptoms that are associated with serotonergic neuronal activity or abnormal serotonergic neuronal activity include listlessness, lethargy, extreme tiredness, memory lapse, lack of interest in the environment, slow wave sleep that is abnormal, and REM onset that is more rapid. That's what I mentioned back in an earlier section. So we're seeing that there is a connection between these things and serotonin. And let's take a look at some of the therapies that we've observed to be useful in modulating serotonin in the brain. Okay, point one, if you increase serotonergic activity, serotonin neuron activity, you end up with more energy. We have observed that exercise, particularly like the kind where it's repetitive motion type exercise, typically increase the release of serotonin. What's one of the first things they tell you to do if you're experiencing depression? Exercise. Problem is, lots of times people feel like they can't because they don't have enough energy. So it's one of those vicious cycles that you kind of need to jump in and initiate and hopefully overpower that desire or that feeling that you cannot do it. So exercise leads to repetitive motor tasks, especially in this type of exercise, increase serotonin release in many individuals. If you deprive REM sleep, as I mentioned in an earlier section, it can also reduce depressive symptoms. That is because less REM equals more activity of the serotonergic systems that are involved, even in the waking state. So it's an effect that lasts longer. It lasts after you are done sleeping, done with your sleep stages, and in your waking state. And if we take some of these concepts and we look at what some of the things that individuals with OCD do, remember, if you have never looked at the subject of obsessive compulsive disorder, we are going to be doing that in this class, but most people are aware of the fact that there are obsessive thoughts, but compulsive behaviors, and very often motor rituals that are very repetitive. And knowing this about the serotonin and increase in its activity with repetitive motoric actions, it has been suggested that perhaps this engagement in these is actually like a way to self-medicate. Of course, you're not thinking about, you're not realizing that that's what you're doing, but in essence, that potentially could be what's happening. We have found that antidepressant therapy in many cases helps individuals to disengage from these various motoric rituals. So kind of package that whole concept through here with the idea serotonin, increase it, you end up with more energy. How do you increase serotonin? Exercise, think about the REM sleep and that there's less serotonin activity during REM. Look at these connections. Try to kind of make all these connections so that they link together and it starts to make sense. Okay, before we go on anymore, I have another little video that I would like to share with you, and I decided that it was worth putting it up and doing that now so that I know for sure you see this. Press it. Okay, hopefully you are aware that that was not real. So funny, I thought. I just had to share it with you. Anyway, let us go on to the more serious topic of HPA axis activity in major depression, its involvement. And this is a more recent component of my lecture, my addressing depression and the underlying biological contributions to it, because this has become more and more clear that a lot of depression is induced by some of this overactivity. Interestingly enough, studies over the last 40 to 50, now 45 years or so, have demonstrated that hyperactivity of this HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal gland, is one of the most consistent biological findings in major depression psychiatry. The mechanisms, as I put here underlying the abnormality, are still unclear. However, it's important to acknowledge that this is a consistent finding. So it's leading us somewhere. I have given you a link here to the Human Brain Facts hypothalamus function. I'm not going to open that up right now. I am going to go on and go through this little diagram for a moment. but some of you are very familiar with the function of the hypothalamus and the fact that the hypothalamus releases that corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, in response to stress to the anterior pituitary gland. Here you go. Which will then release ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone, which then goes into general circulation and prompts the adrenal cortex, the cortices of the adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys, to release glucocorticoids, and primarily we're talking cortisol. So here is that circulating cortisol now. And look at what can happen. This is feeding back. These are glucocorticoid receptors. A lot of different things can interact with these and trigger issues. Inflammation, early life trauma that affects the hypothalamus and leads to this whole circle of events, a cycle that sometimes is very difficult to disrupt and can lead to long-lasting detrimental effects. Inflammation, let me just say, is becoming like a key word in so many different types of disorders. And I'm not talking just things like rheumatoid arthritis, but we're seeing that in a lot of different disorders. So now, here is the rationale laid out in terms of why can this disruption in the HPA axis lead to clinical depression. Okay, glucocorticoids, think cortisol, regulate important neuronal survival, sizes of brain structures such as the hippocampus, leading to memory formation, and affecting emotional appraisal of events. Okay, important to recognize those facts. A significant percentage of depressed patients have increased levels of cortisol in saliva, in plasma, and in urine, and increased size and activity of the pituitary and adrenal glands, meaning they're overactive. They're acting more than they should have to. And I realize now that these should have been little letters A, B, C, D. Forgive the mess up in my outline. Trying hard here. So we've got increased activity of this axis. This axis that kicks in under stress. Think about that. And it's likely due, because we have this increased activity, due to reduced feedback inhibition, negative feedback. All those circulating glucocorticoids are supposed to tell the hypothalamus, stop releasing corticotropin releasing hormone, and it said, let's inhibit that. And that's not happening. Again, this is referring back to some of the theories and treatments earlier on that we talked about. So data that supports this deficit in this glucocorticoid mediated inhibition or problem, it's a deficit. It's not, the cortisol is not being self-limited naturally by the person. And we see this information comes from studies that show that HPA axis activity is not suppressed with dexamethasone as should happen. Now, just going back and again, if you're in my biopsychology of stress class, we're going to be talking a lot more about this as well. But the idea of negative feedback is critical here. So if you don't understand that, please let me know, because it is absolutely critical to understand that naturally we have this signal that says plenty of glucocorticoids out there, stop the release through this cascade of events. And dexamethasone is synthetic glucocorticoid. And when you have that administered, your hypothalamus, and hence your pituitary gland, and then your adrenal glands, should respond by slowing down production and release of their own hormones. However, when you give many individuals who have clinical depression dexamethasone, this suppression does not happen. And it's been found that the function of glucocorticoid receptors, GC, glucocorticoid receptors, glucocorticoid receptor function in peripheral tissues, those tissues that are outside of your central nervous system, are reduced. That function is reduced in many depressed patients. All of this is lending more support to this problem with the negative feedback deficits and increased glucocorticoids and the effect of these elevated levels of glucocorticoids on major limbic structures in your brain. It has been shown that frequently successful antidepressant treatment, AD treatment, is associated with reversing this impairment in negative feedback function, and that the HPA axis resumes more normal functioning, shutting down excessive release of glucocorticoids. Okay. Now, this next section, this again, and I know I've probably said this before, and you're like, okay, enough, we get it, Dr. Putnam, but was one of the reasons I ended up developing a whole sequel to this course, Neurobiology of Childhood Mental Disorders, not just to treat the different disorders that we see specifically developing in childhood or associated with childhood in terms of description and symptomology and what do we do about it, but also the way that early life events can alter HPA axis activity. There's so much robust research now that demonstrates that changes in the HPA activity that occur in the fetus and in early childhood can persist into adulthood. It's been shown that women who are sexually or physically abused in childhood have that enhanced activity of HPA axis in adulthood. It doesn't stop in childhood. This is a long-lasting effect. And again, enhanced activity is great for some things, not when we're talking about HPA axis activity. There is a test called the Trier Social Stress Test, TSST. It's a very well validated instrument that's used to assess people's perception of stress and report of stress. And individuals can actually, while they're doing this, feel stressed. And they found that their enhanced ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary gland, and elevated heart rate responses in these women. And if those women who were sexually or physically abused in childhood are currently depressed, showing symptoms of clinical depression, they have the largest increase in ACTH and cortisol subsequently secretion, as well as increase in heart rate. Now, so one suggestion is HPA axis hyperactivity may not be the consequence of depression, but rather the manifestation of persistent neurobiological abnormalities that predispose somebody to depression. How important is that information? Especially in view of that for a while, it was like, oh, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, which I've talked to some classes about the interesting thought of doing that, but, or just get over it, okay? Sometimes I fear that we're getting into a situation now where very normal feelings of sadness are being treated as pathological. That's a whole nother problem. But this is so important in understanding that there are very likely underlying biological abnormalities, either, you know, earlier, currently, or at some point through depressive episodes. Also, and there is strong evidence for changes in the serotonergic systems by maternal deprivation when there is maternal deprivation during childhood. That again, I only address briefly here because I spend a significant amount of time on that in 398. Okay. Early trauma, interesting, has been linked to adult inflammation. Activated inflammatory biomarkers. Biomarkers that show that you have inflammation, including these down here, are present in adults who demonstrate depressive symptomology. We see increased peripheral, not cerebrospinal fluid, but peripheral plasma concentrations of IL-6, interleukin-6, IL-1B, and tumor necrosis factor, or TNF, in some depressed patients. And that's together with increased levels of that C-reactive protein, CRP, which is a primary marker of the presence of inflammation. It is something that is actually checked for in many of the basic blood work panels that get done, and is CRP levels are watched closely in individuals who have diseases of inflammation. Even in adults who are not demonstrating current depressive symptoms, if there was early trauma, there can still be adult inflammation that is evidenced by increased concentrations of these different biomarkers. Very, very important. And again, this is an area where I wish I could get somebody to go and devote their life's work to this and then come back to me and tell me about it, because there's just not enough time to do this, you know, on your own. And I think this is a really important area for research and investigation. However, I want to, as dismal as that all sounds, this putative causative link is not necessarily inevitable or irreversible. In other words, it's not necessarily, oh my gosh, you experienced this trauma, therefore you will have, and it's with you for the rest of your life. There is optimism, but recognition, acknowledgement are the first steps to reversal in many cases. And I love this word, putative. As some of you know how much I love different words, and putative is a great word to use. That's supposed or proposed to be, and that is a great word to put in your Putnam Dictionary and use sometime in the future. Okay, so we know all this. Where do we go from here? There are lots of places, obviously, and there's a whole nother receptor type that is now being investigated. That's a mineralocorticoid receptor, MR. We shall lovingly refer to it as MR from now on. Activation. MR, those receptors are abundant in limbic areas of the brain. Limbic, emotional centers, centers that are affected and influenced by hypothalamus, hippocampus, depression. And they have high affinity for cortisol. So if there is excess circulating cortisol, these receptors are going to grab it and interact with it. And MR is important in this feedback inhibition that I talked about as being deficient in many people who demonstrate depression. Glucocorticoid receptors and mineralocorticoid receptors actually combine to mediate the brain's response to normal cortisol or glucocorticoid secretion. You need to go through this stepwise again, go back, think about it, turn me off for a minute, take a look at the notes. I'm trying to go through this slowly, but this sequence of events should start going, this makes sense. This means that this could affect that, which could then lead to depression. Okay, so dexamethasone tests only assess glucocorticoid receptor function, okay? So when you get that test, you're not seeing what's happening with mineralocorticoid receptor function. There is a different drug here, spironolactone, and that activates HPA axis by blocking these MR-mediated negative feedback actions by these. So now we have a second test to go in and try to assess these glucocorticoids activation and negative feedbacks. And so we've seen that the effects of this are greater in depressed patients compared to controls. Prednisolone, if you have asthma or something else like that, and it's serious enough, I'm one of those people, prednisolone, those are drugs that your body recognizes as a steroid hormone and helps with inflammation temporarily. And that is able to bind to both glucocorticoid receptors and mineralocorticoid receptors with very similar affinity or strength. Response in these individuals to prednisone is normal, and the response to dexamethasone is impaired. So this is complex. I don't want you to stress out too much about this section. Here's one of the putative explanations. Perhaps mineralocorticoid receptors function to compensate for less glucocorticoid receptor function. And oops, I didn't even finish here. Sorry. Oh, and I forgot, I'm on a crappy laptop. I can't even type everything. So depression. What am I going to require for you to know in this section? Only that we do have these other kinds of receptors that are involved with cortisol, excess cortisol, and they work together with glucocorticoid receptors. That's the most important thing. Please don't spend time going, oh my God, I'm never going to remember all of this. I can't remember these sequences. You don't need to. I have them here because I want you to conceptually get that this relationship is very feasible. So trying to give you a little bit of comfort during stressful times. Okay. Cortisol awakening response. We have cycles, diurnal cycles of cortisol levels. At night, theoretically, we have lower cortisol. In the morning, it starts raising up, and as you are awakening, you have a peak. So physiological stress of awakening results in that peak of cortisol around 30 minutes post-awakening, and then it returns to waking levels by 60 minutes. Now, waking levels of cortisol are higher than sleeping levels, so don't get that mixed up. While you're sleeping, they're low. You start waking up, they're raising, they're rising. Your glucocorticoid levels are going up. Cortisol is going up, going up. About 30 minutes after you wake up, it peaks higher and then comes back down to where it was when you first woke up, okay? And that is an important marker for normal HPA activity. We have found this peaking in response to waking is greater in depressed patients. More cortisol again. Look back at what we just talked about a minute ago in terms of how cortisol can affect neurons and hippocampus and so on. And it seems weird to think about this. It says the physiological stress of awakening. We don't even realize it. Our systems are shifting. We're going from one physiological state to another, allostasis. And so to accommodate those changing conditions, our body goes, ooh, we need to jump up a little bit here. So let's elevate that cortisol. But it shouldn't be too much. And that's a problem that we see in some depressed patients. Now, carbon dioxide inhalation is actually one of the newer tools that has been used to activate stress pathways. You're like, why would you want to activate them? Well, research, studying. Carbon dioxide inhalation increases blood pressure, increases norepinephrine levels in your plasma, blood plasma. It increases salivary alpha amylase, the enzyme that is immediately elevated in response to stress, and cortisol over 30 minutes. And that's important. If you think about breathing differently and how this kind of inhalation will change how you feel by directly affecting the stress system. You can do this in repeated sessions and you still get the same responses. So that is a tool in investigating a little bit more the stress pathways and then ultimately what is occurring elsewhere in the brain and body. Ultradian rhythm. Ultradian, that means within a day. It's not diurnal. It's like found a lot within a day. We have corticosterone in rats. That is the equivalent to our cortisol. It's the same thing for rats as cortisol is for us. And if you have free moving rats that are allowed to go about their business in an area and not confined or restrained, you will see very complex changes in the ultradian rhythms in this endogenous corticosterone level, cortisol for us. It has been shown that the responsivity, the responses of the HPA axis to stress varies during different phases of this ultradian rhythm. We need more testing in humans to basically gain insight as to whether that is something that's happening. In other words, are there different points within our own ultradian rhythms where stressors are going to affect us more than others? very interesting question, one that I suspect will take a while to answer. So here's a direct quote, and I probably should have ended with the rest of your quote here. Oops. Up on my crazy keyboard. Hopefully I can get that. Yay, it worked. Yay. Taking into consideration the large amount of data showing direct effects of clinically effective antidepressants on HPA axis function, it is probably really just a matter of time before the reverse direction will be successful. That is, discovering a new drug that changes HPA function, and that is then a clinically effective antidepressant. Okay. I have given you a gazillion links here for you to take a look at. If you want to try to further explore any of those theories that I talked about, I am not opening them up now. That is something that if you're interested, you can clearly do on your own time. And, but I want to provide you with as much reference material as possible in lieu of a textbook. And because this material is changing so rapidly, it's even hard for textbooks to keep up with it. So here also, I've included a couple of the biochemical diagrams of how we have, precursors to serotonin. Here we go, neurotransmitter. And the precursors it comes from, the enzymes that take the precursor tryptophan, turkey, and help to keep moving it in a forming until finally we get our serotonin. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to reconstruct this or even recognize what this is here or what this is here. Some of you are, pre-med students. Some of you are going more into this line of work, discipline, research. And so I just kind of wanted to provide this for you. And last but not least, it is crazy. Again, I know this is a little worrisome probably that I get excited about this, but the fact that we can take compounds, biological compounds and molecules and use them to do a bunch of different things. And look at this, the connections between epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and dopa here. We'll be talking about L-dopa later on. And just the enzymes that are involved for those of you who are interested. Again, you will not need to replicate this diagram. I will not ask you what this particular thing is right here, but I just wanted to give you some extra material in case you're interested in it. And we will be going on and talking about bipolar and postpartum depression. But this finishes up our unipolar clinical depression material. Again, definitely the bulkiest portion in terms of the individual disorders. We will not be going through future disorders at this great length. And I also felt it was absolutely essential that we look at bipolar disorder and postpartum depression aside from unipolar. So there we go. Moving on to some other aspects of depression, bipolar, in the next lecture.